The lights dimmed, and every pair of eyes in the glass-walled conference room turned toward Clara. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clicked the remote, the first slide appearing on the massive LED screen. This was her moment. Months of late nights condensed into a single presentation. Investors leaned forward, notebooks open, cameras ready. But as she advanced to the next slide, the graphs dissolved into gibberish, random characters dancing where numbers should be. Murmurs rippled across the room. Clara froze, her breath catching. "That's not right," she whispered, frantically clicking again. The next slide appeared, even worse. Broken images, absurd figures, nonsense equations. Laughter erupted from one of the younger investors. "Is this a joke?" he scoffed. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She tried to explain, her voice shaking. It worked perfectly earlier. But the words collapsed under the weight of humiliation. Every second felt like an eternity. At the far end of the table, Mr. Lawson, the billionaire CEO, leaned back in his chair, his face sculpted into a mask of disapproval. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with forced calm, "I apologize for the technical confusion." His voice carried that elegant cruelty only power can afford. He turned toward Clara, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "We expected better preparation from our staff." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the projector. Clara felt the sting like a slap. Her throat burned as she struggled to hold back tears. She wanted to shout that it wasn't her fault, that she'd checked the file a dozen times, but the words wouldn't come. One of the investors whispered something, and a few others smirked. Mr. Lawson offered a rehearsed sigh and motioned for the IT technician to end the chaos. The screen faded to black. "Let's move on," he said curtly. "Time is money." Among the audience, Ethan Lawson, his son, watched everything unfold. His jaw tightened as he noticed the faintest smirk on his father's lips. It wasn't concern he saw there. It was satisfaction. Ethan's stomach turned. Something about the entire scene felt staged. He couldn't understand why his father, always obsessed with control, would allow such a disaster to play out, unless, of course, he'd orchestrated it. Clara stood frozen, gripping the clicker like a lifeline. Mr. Lawson's words sliced through the air once more. "Miss, please step aside. We'll have someone else handle the figures next time." Her hands trembled as she nodded weakly, retreating from the podium. As she passed by him, she caught the faint reflection of herself in the glass wall, pale, humiliated, broken. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The investors whispered behind their hands, pity mixed with amusement. One of them chuckled under his breath, and the sound struck her like an arrow. The humiliation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Her dignity unraveled before a dozen strangers in designer suits. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear before anyone saw her cry. But she stayed just long enough to whisper, "I'm sorry, sir," before fleeing the room. Mr. Lawson didn't answer. Instead, he straightened his tie, smiled to the investors and said smoothly, "These are the challenges of hiring youth. Full of enthusiasm, but not enough experience." Laughter followed, Ethan's fists clenched under the table. He'd seen his father ruthless in business, but this was different. This was cruelty disguised as charm, and it made his chest ache with anger. As Clara disappeared down the hallway, Ethan's eyes followed her. He noticed something. A small silver USB drive had slipped from her bag, landing near her empty chair. His instincts sharpened. He glanced at his father, who now basked in polite applause, and a thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't an accident at all? His heart began to race, a storm of suspicion brewing inside him. And here's the thing, haven't we all been in a moment like that? When everything you've worked for collapses in front of everyone and no one stands up for you? If you've ever felt underestimated, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Clara's place? Because this story is just beginning. When the meeting ended, the investors moved on as if nothing had happened. Papers rustled, deals resumed, and Clara's reputation lay shattered on the floor like glass. She sat alone in the restroom minutes later, staring at her reflection under harsh white lights. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks. "I can't believe this," she whispered, her voice hollow. Every dream she had about being taken seriously, gone. She replayed every second in her mind. The glitching slides, the looks, the laughter. None of it made sense. She was careful, thorough, obsessive even. How could everything have gone wrong at once? Something deep inside her whispered that it wasn't her fault. But who would believe a secretary over a billionaire? She wiped her tears, forced a weak smile, and told herself to survive the day. Meanwhile, Ethan walked silently through the corridors, the weight of what he'd seen pressing on his chest. His father's investors congratulated Mr. Lawson for handling the incident gracefully, unaware that the grace they admired was cruelty in disguise. Ethan's phone buzzed with messages from friends praising the presentation's recovery. He didn't reply. All he could see was Clara's face, terrified, humiliated, betrayed. He slipped into the empty conference room, scanning the table until he found the USB drive she had dropped. It was small, unremarkable, except for the label "Final Presentation." He turned it over in his palm, the metal warm from the lights. Why would her file fail like that? He knew she was competent. He'd seen her work countless times. There was only one explanation that made sense. Someone had switched it. Back in his office, Ethan closed the blinds and inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen lit up, revealing clean slides, flawless charts, and a level of innovation that could have impressed any boardroom in the world. His jaw tightened as realization hit him like a punch. Clara's file was perfect, which meant the one used in the meeting wasn't hers. His pulse quickened. Who would dare do that? But deep down, he already knew the answer. He looked at the company's security cameras on his monitor. With a few clicks, he accessed the meeting room footage from earlier that morning. The playback showed Mr. Lawson's assistant entering quietly, glancing around, then plugging in a different USB drive. Ethan leaned closer, his breath shallow. Frame by frame, the truth unfolded, and it was undeniable. His father had sabotaged Clara. Ethan sank back into his chair, stunned. The man everyone admired, the one he'd grown up trying to emulate, had humiliated an innocent woman just to look superior. The thought made his stomach twist. He closed his eyes, remembering the faint smile on his father's face when Clara fled the room. Now that smile felt like a confession, a silent, merciless confession of pride and control. Outside, the city glimmered through the glass walls of Lawson Tower, indifferent to the storms brewing within. Down below, Clara stepped into the cold evening air, clutching her purse like a shield. Every step echoed with the memory of laughter and the sting of betrayal. She didn't know it yet, but the man she thought was just another rich executive's son was already rewriting the story she thought was over. Ethan looked out over the skyline, the lights reflecting in his eyes like fragments of resolve. "You went too far this time, Dad," he murmured under his breath. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of rebellion. He pocketed Clara's USB and turned off the monitor. In the silence that followed, one truth became clear. Justice would have to start from within, and somewhere deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about a secretary's humiliation. It was about power, conscience, and the line between admiration and defiance. What began as one woman's shame was about to become a reckoning for them all, and the next move belonged to him. Clara's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, uneven and hurried. The farther she walked, the smaller she felt, until the bustling offices swallowed her whole. People turned their heads as she passed, some pretending not to notice, others whispering behind manicured hands. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. Failure, embarrassment, incompetence, labels she had worked her entire life to erase, now clung to her like a curse. She pushed into the women's restroom and locked the door behind her. The air smelled of disinfectant and flowers, too clean for the chaos inside her chest. Her reflection stared back, pale and trembling. "How could this happen?" she whispered. Her lipstick had faded, her confidence shattered. She wanted to disappear, to erase herself from the memory of every person in that room. But the humiliation had already carved itself deep. Back in the boardroom, the investors were sipping champagne again, their laughter floating above the hum of casual conversation. Mr. Lawson moved among them like a king in his court, polished, calm, in control. "Minor technical issue," he explained smoothly, as if nothing significant had occurred. "She's talented but inexperienced." The men nodded, the incident already fading from their minds. For them, Clara was a forgettable footnote. Ethan remained seated, pretending to check his phone. He could still hear Clara's voice breaking, still see the fear in her eyes. His father's ability to dismiss her pain so easily made his skin crawl. Every instinct inside him screamed that it wasn't a glitch, it was a setup. He replayed the scene again and again in his mind, searching for clues, the assistant's nervous glance, the perfectly timed malfunction. It all aligned too well to be coincidence. Later that afternoon, the building emptied as employees went to lunch. Clara emerged from the restroom, her face washed but her eyes swollen. She walked back to her desk in silence, ignoring the looks that followed her. On her computer screen, unread emails stacked like accusations. One subject line stood out, "Meeting feedback." Her hand trembled as she opened it. It was from Mr. Lawson's office. "Please schedule a meeting to discuss your future with the company." Her stomach dropped. Discuss my future. Everyone knew what that meant. She closed her eyes, fighting the wave of nausea rising in her throat. Just days ago, she dreamed of earning a promotion. Now, she was counting the hours until she'd be escorted out with a cardboard box. Still, something inside her refused to break completely. "No," she whispered to herself, "not like this." Ethan waited until the floor was nearly empty before approaching her. His footsteps were soft, hesitant. "Clara," he said gently, standing a few feet away. She looked up, startled, eyes red, posture defensive. "I just wanted to check if you're all right." Her lips trembled. "I'm fine," she lied, gathering her papers. "Please don't. I know what people are saying." Her voice cracked. "I just need to leave before it gets worse." He hesitated, wanting to tell her everything, the footage, his suspicions, his father's possible role. But something held him back. This wasn't the right place. Cameras, staff, and walls had ears in Lawson Tower. "Clara," he said softly, "don't make any decisions today. Please." She blinked, confused by the urgency in his tone. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I don't think this was your fault." For a heartbeat, hope flickered in her eyes. Then it vanished. "That's kind of you," she murmured, "but it doesn't change what they saw." She grabbed her purse and stood. "Mr. Lawson was right. Maybe I wasn't ready." Her words were heavy, practiced, like someone already trying to believe the lie. Ethan watched her go, frustration tightening his chest. He wanted to call her back, to tell her she'd been framed. But proof. He needed proof first. When she stepped outside, the wind hit her like a slap, cold and sharp. The city buzzed around her, unaware of her collapse. Taxis honked, screens flashed, and life went on. She walked aimlessly for blocks, her heels clicking against the pavement. The world blurred into light and noise, but inside there was only silence. The kind that follows betrayal. Somewhere between anger and grief, she stopped caring which one hurt more. In the office above, Ethan returned to his desk, jaw tight. He couldn't focus on work. Every spreadsheet, every memo seemed meaningless compared to what he'd witnessed. He opened his drawer and stared at the small silver USB drive resting inside. Final presentation. The label mocked him. It was the last piece of her dignity, and the first clue to exposing his father's lie. "If I'm right," he whispered, "he's gone too far." That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table surrounded by silence. Her apartment was small but tidy, a single plant by the window, a photo of her parents smiling beside a candle. She opened her laptop to write her resignation letter. The words came slowly, painfully. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I believe my position is no longer sustainable." Her tears stained the keyboard before she could hit send. The email remained unsent, glowing softly in the dark. Across town, Ethan sat in his own office, lights dim, the city glowing behind him like a sea of fire. He opened his laptop, inserted the USB, and waited. The screen flickered to life. The presentation loaded perfectly. Every chart, every slide pristine, his suspicion hardened into certainty. "It was never her fault," he said aloud, voice low but shaking with fury. The betrayal wasn't just against Clara. Against everything he thought his family stood for. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline. The Lawson name illuminated half the city. But tonight, it felt like a curse. The truth pressed heavy against his ribs. To expose it would destroy his father's reputation, maybe the entire company, but to stay silent would make him complicit. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized the cost of integrity, and it terrified him. Down below, Clara sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall. The city lights smeared across the glass like tears. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I'll hand it in." She closed her laptop, unaware that someone else, someone she barely knew, was fighting quietly on her behalf. Fate was already rewriting her story, but for now she only saw darkness. The storm outside matched the one inside her heart, and somewhere between those two storms, his guilt and her grief, the line between truth and silence began to blur. The stage was set, and though neither of them knew it yet, the next chapter would bring them face to face, not as colleagues, but as allies, and the war for justice had just begun. The night draped itself over Lawson Tower like a velvet curtain. Most of the lights on the upper floors had gone out, leaving only a few glowing offices scattered across the skyline. Ethan sat alone in his father's corner suite, the silence broken only by the hum of computers. His heart pounded as he pulled up the company's security feed, the blue glow painting his face. He wasn't supposed to be here, but justice rarely waited for permission. He scrolled through the footage of that morning, minute by minute. At first, everything looked ordinary. Employees setting up the meeting room, the catering team arranging coffee. Then, at 8:42 a.m., movement caught his eye. His father's assistant, Greg, slipped in quietly, looking over his shoulder. Ethan leaned closer. His pulse quickening, Greg approached Clara's laptop, unplugged her USB, and replaced it with another one from his pocket. The betrayal was now undeniable. He froze the frame, the evidence glowing like a wound on the screen. "You actually did it," Ethan whispered. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He'd seen his father manipulate competitors before, but to sabotage his own employee. It was monstrous. He copied the footage to an external drive, his hands trembling slightly. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, as if the sky itself was passing judgment. He opened the file from Clara's original USB once more. The presentation was flawless, a masterpiece of clarity and insight. Each graph aligned perfectly, every color chosen with precision. Her ideas were revolutionary, far ahead of the company's current projects. Ethan realized something chilling. If she had presented this version, the investors would have praised her, not his father. That's why the sabotage had happened. Pride, not profit, had driven the betrayal. He leaned back, the pieces fitting together with cruel simplicity. His father's empire wasn't built on innovation, it was built on control. "No one outshines Lawson," Ethan muttered, the words echoing his father's philosophy. He thought of Clara's trembling hands, her shame, her broken voice. The weight of injustice pressed heavily on his chest. "You destroyed her just to protect your ego," he whispered. "But I saw you." For a long moment, he just sat there, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He could feel the enormity of what he was about to do. Exposing the truth would mean turning against his own blood, his own name. But silence would make him a coward. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "You taught me to never tolerate weakness," he said softly. "So maybe it's time you see what real strength looks like." Meanwhile, Clara lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The faint hum of traffic outside was the only sound. Her mind replayed the meeting like a cruel film loop, the glitch, the laughter, the looks of pity. She tried to find peace in the thought that tomorrow she'd resign and leave it all behind. But deep down, something still didn't add up. "I checked it," she murmured. "I know I did." The unease refused to fade. Back at the tower, Ethan printed copies of the security screenshots and sealed them in an envelope. He labeled it with 3 words: "The real truth." His fingers hesitated before closing it. Every moral line he'd been taught blurred in that instant. Betraying his father felt wrong, but letting Clara suffer felt worse. Maybe this isn't betrayal, he thought. Maybe this is redemption. He slipped the envelope into his briefcase, knowing there was no turning back. The elevator doors slid open behind him, startling him. Greg stepped out, surprised to see Ethan still in the building. "Working late?" Greg asked, forcing a casual smile. Ethan's heart kicked into overdrive, but his face remained calm. "Just catching up," he replied smoothly. "You?" Greg shrugged. The boss wanted tomorrow's figures double-checked. His tone was light, but his eyes were cautious, guarded. They exchanged polite smiles, but beneath the surface, tension coiled tight. When Greg left, Ethan watched his reflection fade in the closing elevator doors. He knew that man was a pawn, loyal to his father, bound by fear or greed, but pawns still left traces. Ethan turned off the lights, locked the suite, and stepped into the storm outside. Rain soaked his coat instantly, cold and merciless. Still, he walked with purpose. The drive home was a blur of neon and thunder. Each red light felt like a moment to reconsider, yet his conviction only grew stronger. By the time he reached his apartment, the envelope felt heavier than his briefcase. He set it on the table, staring at it for a long while. Justice had never felt so dangerous. "Tomorrow," he told himself, "tomorrow she'll know the truth." Clara's alarm went off at dawn. Her eyes were swollen, her heart heavy, but she got dressed anyway. One last day. She rehearsed her resignation speech in her head as she walked through the rain. Inside the lobby, people avoided her gaze, whispers trailing behind like smoke. She kept her chin up, though her soul wanted to collapse. She didn't know it yet, but across the building Ethan was already waiting. He watched from his office window as she arrived, clutching her umbrella like a shield. For a moment, he hesitated, afraid of how she'd react. Would she believe him, or think he was just pitying her? But then he remembered the look in her eyes yesterday, the flicker of hope buried beneath the hurt. That was enough. He grabbed the envelope and headed for the elevator. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him. When the elevator opened, Clara was already walking toward the HR department. Ethan intercepted her gently. "Clara, wait," he said. She froze, weary but polite. "Ethan, please, not now. Just give me 2 minutes," he interrupted softly. "I need to show you something." She hesitated, torn between exhaustion and curiosity. His sincerity broke through her defenses. 2 minutes, she said finally. He led her into an empty conference room and placed the envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked cautiously. "Proof," he said, "of what really happened." Her eyes narrowed, distrust flickering again. Ethan met her gaze, unwavering. "You were set up," he continued quietly. "The presentation wasn't your failure. It was replaced before you ever touched it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Clara blinked, her breath catching. "That's impossible," she whispered. But Ethan only nodded toward the envelope. "See for yourself." She reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling as if the truth might burn. Inside, the screenshots and copied footage waited, the undeniable evidence of betrayal. She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief, then horror, then something fierce. "He did this," she said softly. Ethan nodded. He did. For the first time since that disastrous meeting, Clara's shame began to fade, replaced by something sharper. Anger. Righteous, powerful anger. "Why?" she asked, voice trembling. "Because you Ethan hesitated before answering. The silence that followed was electric. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain pounding against the windows, and somewhere between the thunderclaps, a promise formed. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, the sun rose behind a curtain of fog, casting the Lawson building in a ghostly light. Clara sat at her desk, staring blankly at her monitor. The knowledge from the night before clung to her like a secret too heavy to bear. In time she glanced toward Mr. Lawson's office, her stomach twisted. How could someone so powerful feel threatened by her? She was just a secretary, or so she'd believed until now. Ethan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night combing through more files, building a case so airtight it would expose everything. But evidence alone wasn't enough. He needed to understand why. What could drive his father to such pettiness? As the morning buzz filled the office, he made his way to a private floor, the one few dared to enter without invitation. The walls up there smelled of old money and fear. He found Mr. Alcott, one of Lawson's oldest advisors, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. The man looked startled when Ethan appeared. "Mr. Ethan," he greeted carefully, "your father's not in yet." Ethan nodded. "I'm not here for him." He closed the door and lowered his voice. "Tell me something, Alcott. Why did my father set up Clara Hayes?" The old man's eyes widened, then dropped to his trembling hands. "I don't know what you mean," Alcott began, but his voice lacked conviction. Ethan stepped closer, placing a USB on the desk, the footage. "Then maybe you should watch this before you answer." Silence filled the room. The older man sighed, shoulders sagging. "He wanted control," he said finally. "That girl. She was talented, too talented. Her project impressed the investors last quarter. He feared they'd start seeing her as the future, not him." Ethan's throat tightened. "He humiliated her to protect his ego?" Alcott nodded slowly. "Your father built this empire from the ground up. The idea that someone, especially a young woman, could outshine him. It terrified him." The advisor's voice trembled with something close to pity. "He doesn't believe in sharing credit. To him, every success must carry the Lawson name." Ethan stared out the window, jaw clenched. Pride, that was his father's poison. Meanwhile, Clara sat in the employee lounge, scrolling through job listings she could barely focus on. Her resignation email sat drafted, unsent. She knew she should leave, but leaving felt like surrendering the last piece of her dignity. Ethan's voice from yesterday replayed in her mind. You were set up. It both comforted and tormented her. Knowing the truth didn't erase the shame. It only made it heavier. Because now she knew her humiliation had been intentional. In his office, Mr. Lawson arrived, radiating authority as usual. Assistants trailed behind him, carrying coffee and folders. "Morning, sir," Greg greeted nervously. "The investors requested follow-ups on yesterday's figures." Lawson waved a dismissive hand. "They'll get what I give them." His tone dripped with arrogance. "And our little secretary?" he asked casually. "Still planning her exit?" Greg nodded. "She'll be gone by noon." Lawson smiled faintly. "Good. Dead weight slows progress." Ethan stood outside the glass door, hearing every word. A wave of disgust washed over him. He stepped aside before his father could notice him, his pulse pounding in his ears. The mask of charm Mr. Lawson wore so easily, the polished smile, the elegant posture, it all looked hollow now, a facade built on the pain of others. Ethan realized he wasn't just exposing corruption, he was facing the rot at the heart of his own family. He returned to his office, anger simmering just beneath the surface. On his desk lay the printed copies of Clara's flawless presentation. He flipped through the pages, each one proof of her brilliance, and his father's insecurity. "You feared her," he muttered under his breath. "You feared what she represented, equality, talent, change, everything Mr. Lawson had built his empire to control." Ethan's reflection in the glass looked older somehow, hardened by betrayal. Clara's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ethan. "Meet me at noon. There's more you need to know." Her pulse quickened as she read it. Part of her wanted to delete it, to walk away and never look back. But curiosity burned stronger than fear. If there was more to the story, she needed to hear it. She typed back one word. "Where?" His reply came seconds later. Café Viridian, 12 in so sharp. At 11:45, she left the building quietly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The autumn wind bit at her cheeks as she crossed the street. Café Viridian sat tucked between skyscrapers, warm light spilling from its windows. Inside, the smell of coffee and cinnamon wrapped around her like comfort. She spotted Ethan at a corner table, his expression serious, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. For a moment, neither spoke. "You look like you haven't slept," she said softly, sitting across from him. He smiled faintly. "I haven't. I found out why he did it." Her eyes flickered with apprehension. "Why?" Ethan hesitated, then told her everything, about Alcott, about his father's obsession with dominance, about how her success had threatened his sense of control. With every word, her disbelief deepened. When he finished, she sat back, silent, staring at her untouched cup. "So, I was right," she said finally, voice brittle. "It wasn't about business. It was about pride." Ethan nodded. He wanted to remind everyone who held the power. She laughed bitterly. "And he did. He made sure I'd never forget it." Her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "You shouldn't be telling me this," she added quietly. "If he finds out," Ethan cut her off gently. "Then he finds out. But I can't let him keep getting away with it." For a moment, Clara studied him. There was something raw in his eyes. Guilt, defiance, maybe both. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because it's right," he replied simply, "and because I should have stopped him sooner." The silence that followed was heavy but not hopeless. Clara looked down at the steaming coffee between them and whispered, "Then maybe we stop him together." Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing streaks of sunlight cutting through the clouds. The cafe windows glowed golden. For the first time in days, Clara's heartbeat steadied. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had company now. Resolve. Across the table, Ethan nodded slowly, a small smile forming. "Then it's settled," he said. "We'll show them the truth." And in that quiet, shared moment, their alliance was born. Neither of them noticed Greg passing by outside, phone pressed to his ear. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of them through the window. "Yeah," he whispered to the voice on the other end. "You were right. He's with her." He paused, smirking faintly. "Want me to tell Mr. Lawson?" The voice replied. Something inaudible. Greg's smirk widened. Understood. And with that, the first crack in their secret plan had already begun to form. Rain returned that night, thin and relentless, tapping against the cafe windows like a ticking clock. Clara stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, lost in thought. Hours had passed since her conversation with Ethan, yet her heart still raced. She couldn't decide what frightened her more, the truth of what he'd revealed, or the idea of what they might do next. Every instinct warned her not to cross a man like Mr. Lawson, but the humiliation she'd endured refused to fade quietly. Ethan sat across from her, the dim light glinting off his watch. "I know this is dangerous," he said, voice low but firm. "But we can't let him bury what he did." Clara looked at him, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't understand," she whispered. "People like him don't lose. They destroy anything that threatens them." Ethan leaned closer, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we make sure he can't destroy us." A small silence hung between them, filled only by the murmur of rain and soft jazz from the speakers. Clara's mind flashed back to that awful meeting. The laughter, the shame, her father's face when she'd told him she'd finally been trusted with something big. How proud he'd been. Now, the memory only stung. "If we do this," she said finally, "we need to be careful. If he finds out what you've shown me, you'll lose everything too." Ethan nodded. "I already have." He pulled a small folder from his bag and slid it across the table. Inside were printed copies of the security footage stills, undeniable proof. Clara's breath caught as she flipped through them. "This is everything," she murmured. "You could end his career." Ethan shook his head slowly. "This isn't about ending him, Clara. It's about restoring what he stole from you." His voice softened. "Your dignity, your truth." For the first time in days, she met his eyes and didn't look away. There was something steady, almost protective in his gaze. "You believe in me more than I do," she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Then I'll believe enough for both of us." She looked down, fighting back tears. "You barely know me," she whispered. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I know what injustice looks like. And I've watched it wear my father's face for too long." The waitress passed by, refilling their cups, oblivious to the storm brewing over that small table. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the city into streaks of silver and gold. Clara traced her finger over one of the printed images. Greg's face, frozen mid-action, switching the USBs. "We can't just release this," she said. "He'll spin the story. Make me look vindictive." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we don't leak it. We show it. When the whole world is watching." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Next week, the annual investor gala. He's presenting again, right? We'll replace his file this time with the truth." Clara blinked, speechless. "You want to expose him publicly?" "Exactly where he exposed you," Ethan replied. The idea was madness, but part of her, the part that had died in that boardroom, began to stir again. A spark of defiance, faint but real. Clara leaned back,
If we do this,
shakily, she said, there's no going back. Ethan's tone softened. You already crossed that line the day he humiliated you. She stared at the folder again, the weight of what they were planning sinking in. I should be terrified, she whispered. You are, he said with a small smile. That's how you know you're doing something brave. His words hung in the air like a promise. They left the cafe together, umbrellas barely holding against the wind. The city. Around them shimmered with wet neon, puddles reflecting fragments of light. As they walked, Clara noticed how Ethan's stride had changed. No longer hesitant, but purposeful. You've done things like this before, she said. Gone against him. Ethan's jaw tightened. Not like this. This time it's personal. His voice was quiet, but laced with conviction. When they reached the street corner, Clara paused. If he finds out before we're ready, she began. Then he'll come for me first, Ethan finished, and I'll handle it. His tone was steady, almost fearless, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what he was risking. Clara wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away while he still could. But deep down, she knew it was too late. They were already bound by the truth. That night, she couldn't sleep. The rain hadn't stopped, and the city felt restless, uneasy. She sat by the window, the folder open on her lap. Each photograph glared up at her like a ghost demanding justice. Next week, she whispered. Next week it ends. For the first time, the thought didn't fill her with fear, but with power. Across the city, in a dark apartment overlooking the skyline, Ethan sat awake, feeling the same pulse of resolve. At dawn, the storm cleared. The streets shone under the first blush of sunrise. Clara arrived early at work, her head held high. The whispers still followed her, but today she didn't care. Each step toward her desk felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Ethan passed by later, pretending not to know her, slipping her a note instead. We begin tonight. Her fingers tightened around it. The plan was real now. That evening, when the building emptied, Ethan and Clara met again, this time in the company's small server room. The hum of machines filled the air like a heartbeat. Are you sure about this? Clara asked, glancing at the rows of glowing monitors. If we're caught, we won't be, Ethan interrupted. Greg has access and I have his login. She stared at him, stunned. How did you... Let's just say Dad isn't the only one who can manipulate people. Ethan inserted a flash drive, the progress bar creeping across the screen. Every click, every flicker of light felt monumental. Clara stood guard near the door, her pulse thrumming in her ears. When the transfer finished, Ethan turned to her. It's done, he said. The truth is ready. She exhaled slowly, her hands shaking. So now we wait? Now, Ethan replied. We prepare to burn down his lies, one slide at a time. They left quietly, blending into the night. Neither spoke as they walked to their cars, the air between them thick with anticipation. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a storm waiting to break. And though she didn't see it, Ethan smiled faintly to himself. You're stronger than you think, he whispered. But somewhere behind them, in the shadows near the parking lot, a figure watched. Phone in hand, recording everything. Morning sunlight spilled through the vast glass walls of Lawson Tower, painting everything in cold gold. Ethan stood by his father's office door, his reflection caught between two worlds, the man he was and the man he refused to become. Inside, he could hear the low rumble of Mr. Lawson's voice through the phone. Even without seeing him, Ethan knew that tone, controlled, commanding, and utterly certain of its own power. It was the sound of a man who never doubted he was right. When the call ended, Ethan stepped inside. You wanted to see me, he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Mr. Lawson looked up, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. "Yes," he said. "I hear you've been spending time with Miss Hayes." The words carried a quiet threat. Ethan forced a casual shrug. "I'm checking on the fallout." "She's planning to resign." His father's expression hardened. "Good. The sooner she's gone, the better." Ethan sat across from him, studying the man who had once seemed larger than life. Every line on Mr. Lawson's face spoke of ambition carved in stone. "Why her?" Ethan asked suddenly. His father raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You humiliated her in front of everyone," Ethan continued. "For what? A mistake? Or because she dared to stand out?" The older man leaned back, lips curling into a faint smile. "You've been listening to gossip." "Don't insult me," Ethan said quietly. The silence between them grew heavy, electric. Mr. Lawson's smile faded. "You think I care about a secretary's pride?" he said finally. "This company was built on strength, Ethan, not sympathy. She made a mistake. She paid the price. That's how the world works." Ethan felt anger coil in his chest. "Or maybe you couldn't stand that she was better than you." The older man's eyes flashed with cold fury. Mr. Lawson rose from his chair, his presence towering. "Careful," he warned. "You're speaking like a man who doesn't understand power." Ethan stood too, refusing to flinch. "Maybe I'm just starting to understand it for the first time." The silence that followed was like thunder trapped in glass. Mr. Lawson adjusted his cufflinks, masking his temper with elegance. "You're emotional," he said. "That's weakness. A leader must never show guilt." Ethan looked at him and saw for the first time not strength, but fear. "You call it leadership," he said quietly. "I call it cowardice." His father's jaw tightened. "You think compassion will save you? It will bury you." Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping back. "If that's true, then maybe being buried is better than living like you." The words hit like a blade, slicing through decades of silence. For a fleeting second, Mr. Lawson's eyes wavered, then hardened again. After Ethan left the office, the hallway felt suffocating. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and deception. He pressed his hand to his chest, trying to steady his racing pulse. His father's words still echoed inside him. Weakness, guilt, emotion. The things he'd been taught to hide were the very things that now defined him. He knew then that there was no going back. The man in that office was no longer his mentor. He was his enemy. Downstairs, Clara worked quietly at her desk, unaware of the storm unfolding above her. She could feel the eyes of others on her, but kept her focus steady. Her resignation letter was printed and folded neatly in her bag. Yet something in her resisted turning it in. A flicker of courage, born from the truth Ethan had shown her, kept her still. For once, she wasn't running. She was waiting for the right moment to fight back. Greg appeared by her desk, offering a thin smile. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "The gala presentation." Clara forced a polite nod. "Yes, sir." His eyes lingered on her a beat too long. "You're not planning anything dramatic, are you?" The words chilled her. "Of course not," she replied evenly. Greg smirked. "Good. I'd hate for you to make another scene." When he walked away, Clara's stomach turned. He knew something. That evening, Ethan met her in the parking garage. "He's suspicious," she said immediately. "Greg said something. He knows we're up to something." Ethan frowned. "Then we move faster." He opened his briefcase and handed her a small device. "What's this?" she asked. "A backup," he replied. "If anything happens to me, plug this in during the gala. It'll play the truth automatically." Her eyes widened. "Don't talk like that." Ethan's voice was calm. "We plan for everything." They sat in the car for a moment, the hum of rain against the windshield filling the silence. "Do you ever wonder," Clara said softly, "what made him like that? Your father, I mean." Ethan stared out the window. Every day. He thought of childhood memories, the lessons on strength, the punishments for mistakes, the praise for dominance. He wasn't always cruel, Ethan said, but he learned that fear is easier to earn than respect, and he never forgot it. Clara looked at him, empathy flickering through her fear. "You're nothing like him," she said. Ethan turned to her, offering a sad smile. "That's what I'm afraid of," he murmured, "that maybe the only reason I can see his flaws is because I share them." She shook her head. "No, you see them because you have something he doesn't, conscience." The word lingered, soft yet powerful. For the first time, Ethan believed her. Back in his penthouse, Mr. Lawson poured himself a drink and stared at the city below. His reflection in the glass seemed older, heavier. Greg's voice buzzed through the intercom. "I saw your son with her again," he reported. "They're planning something." Lawson's jaw tightened. "Let them plan," he said coldly. "We'll remind them who holds the power." His tone was calm, but his knuckles whitened around the glass until it cracked. At the same hour, Clara sat at her kitchen table, rehearsing what she'd say if things went wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered, staring at her reflection in the window, "the truth you're about to see." But the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure she could face that room again. Then she remembered Ethan's voice, steady, certain. "You're stronger than you think." She exhaled, closing her eyes. "I'll prove it," she whispered. Meanwhile, Ethan paced his apartment, unable to rest. The city lights flickered against the ceiling like restless ghosts. Tomorrow could change everything, or destroy it all. He knew his father would not hesitate to crush them if he sensed betrayal. But for the first time, fear didn't stop him. It sharpened him. He opened his laptop, reviewing the plan one last time. No more shadows, he thought. No more silence. Outside, thunder rolled once more, distant but growing closer. It felt less like a storm and more like a warning. Both father and son stared at the same city, unaware that their paths were on a collision course. In the darkness between them, two opposing legacies prepared to clash, pride against conscience, power against truth. And when the sun rose again, one of them would fall. The night before the gala, Lawson Tower was nearly deserted. Only a few offices still glowed with fluorescent light, the hum of servers echoing like whispers. Ethan stood in the data department, sleeves rolled up, the glow from the monitors painting his face pale blue. He wasn't alone tonight. Two trusted employees, Maya and Lucas, worked beside him, their expressions focused but nervous. They were the kind of people who valued truth more than paychecks. "You're sure you want to do this?" Maya asked, her voice low. "If your father finds out, we'll all be finished." Ethan didn't look up. "He'll find out eventually," he said. "The difference is, this time he won't win." Lucas adjusted his glasses, scanning the digital files on screen. "We've got her original data logs," he said. "The timestamps prove it was tampered with." Ethan nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Good. That's what we'll need tomorrow." The room felt heavy with purpose. Every keystroke, every click was a small act of rebellion. Maya whispered, "Why are you risking this for her?" Ethan paused, then answered honestly, "Because she did nothing wrong. And because I'm tired of pretending my father's version of success is worth destroying people for." His voice trembled slightly but carried conviction. The two exchanged glances, realizing they weren't just helping him, they were helping themselves. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her apartment surrounded by note cards and documents. She rehearsed her words again and again, her reflection in the mirror becoming her audience. Each time she faltered on the same line, the one where she'd have to face Mr. Lawson. The idea of confronting him still made her hands shake. But when she looked at the evidence Ethan had given her, the fear began to melt into something fiercer: resolve. By midnight, Ethan and his allies finished compiling the restored version of Clara's presentation, the one his father had sabotaged. Every slide was verified, every timestamp backed by digital records. It was perfect. "Encrypt it twice," Ethan instructed. "If he gets suspicious, I don't want him deleting it." Maya nodded. "Done. It's locked tighter than his offshore accounts." Lucas grinned nervously. "Let's just hope we get to show it." When they finally shut off the lights, the city outside was drenched in mist. Ethan walked home through quiet streets, the faint glow of street lamps stretching across puddles. The world felt suspended, the calm before impact. He thought of Clara, probably awake like him, facing her fears in silence. For a brief moment he wished they could both just walk away, but justice demanded more than escape. It demanded exposure. At dawn, Clara arrived at work early, her heart pounding like a drumbeat. She carried nothing but her laptop and a single flash drive, the backup of the real presentation. Her usual timid steps were gone, each stride echoed with quiet defiance. As she passed the reception desk, she caught her reflection in the glass, the same woman who'd once been humiliated, but now her eyes burned with purpose. "He won't take my voice again." In the control room upstairs, Ethan briefed Maya and Lucas one last time. "If anything happens to me during the presentation, you'll trigger the backup," he said. Maya frowned. "Don't talk like that." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "Just covering every angle. He's unpredictable when cornered." Lucas handed him a small earpiece. "We'll be monitoring everything. The second he tries to pull something, we'll know." Ethan nodded. "Then let's finish this." Elsewhere, Mr. Lawson reviewed his own speech, standing before a mirror. His reflections smiled back, confident and unshaken. He had no idea that half his empire was plotting against him beneath the same roof. "Time to remind them who runs this company," he murmured. Greg entered quietly. "Everything's ready for tonight," he said. "Except your son. He's been distant." Lawson chuckled. "Let him sulk. He'll learn loyalty the hard way." The hours dragged on like centuries. By afternoon, preparations for the investor gala filled the building with noise. Caterers, decorators, technicians. Crystal glasses clinked, cameras were tested, and tension hummed beneath the surface like a hidden wire. Clara avoided everyone, keeping her eyes down and her mind sharp. Ethan watched her from across the floor, their gazes meeting for a brief, silent moment that said more than words ever could. In the tech department, Maya monitored the security feeds, chewing on her lip. "I don't like this," she muttered. "He's got cameras everywhere." Lucas glanced at the monitors. "If he spots us, we're done." Maya exhaled sharply. "Then let's not get spotted." They worked quickly, rerouting video signals and masking data trails. "For once," she said with a grin, "it is saving the world." Lucas chuckled nervously. "Yeah, or ending our careers." By evening, the building transformed. The once sterile lobby now glowed under chandeliers filled with laughter and champagne. Clara arrived in a modest yet dignified. She stood near the edge of the crowd, unseen but watching everything. Ethan approached quietly, his suit sharp, his expression steady. "You ready?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No, but I'll do it anyway." He nodded. "That's what courage looks like." Upstairs, Greg whispered into his phone. "They're here," he said. "Both of them." On the other end, Mr. Lawson's voice was calm. "Let them have their little rebellion," he said. "I'll crush it in front of everyone." He hung up, adjusting his tie in the mirror. In his world, exposure was power and humiliation was strategy. What he didn't realize was that this time the spotlight he so loved was about to turn against him. As the gala began, music swelled through the grand hall. Investors filled every seat, murmuring with excitement. Ethan watched his father step onto the stage, his charisma lighting up the room. "Tonight," Mr. Lawson began, "we celebrate innovation, integrity, and the future of Lawson Enterprises." Ethan almost laughed at the irony. He glanced toward Clara, who stood backstage, clutching her flash drive. The truth was ready. So were they. Behind the stage curtains, Maya's voice came through Ethan's earpiece. "We're all set," she whispered. "Everything's in place." Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, his heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of the applause. Clara took one slow breath, closing her eyes. This is it. In the next few minutes, truth and power would collide, and no one in that glittering room would leave unchanged. The empire built on pride was about to tremble. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Tower shimmered with gold light and nervous anticipation. Investors filled every seat, the air thick with money and perfume. Waiters moved like clockwork, balancing crystal flutes of champagne that sparkled beneath chandeliers. At the front, a massive screen glowed with the company's logo, Lawson Enterprises. The future begins here. Mr. Lawson's name was on every tongue, his reputation towering even before he appeared. But somewhere among the polished guests, truth waited quietly to be seen. Clara arrived early, heart pounding as she walked through the glittering lobby. Her black dress was simple, elegant, unassuming, yet tonight it felt like armor. She had spent hours preparing herself to face this room again, the same kind of audience that had watched her humiliation. Now she stood straighter, refusing to shrink. She could feel eyes following her, but none of them knew the storm she carried in her bag, a small flash drive containing justice. Tonight, she would not tremble. Ethan stood near the sound booth, disguised by professionalism. His suit was crisp, his expression calm, but tension hummed beneath his skin like static. Through the discreet earpiece, Maya's voice came softly. "Systems are ready. Backup files secured. Feed can switch on your signal." Lucas added quietly, "Security's tight but blind on Channel 6. Ethan nodded subtly, his eyes fixed on the stage. "Good," he whispered. "We'll only get one shot at this." When Mr. Lawson finally entered, the entire room seemed to tilt toward him. The billionaire walked with quiet command, a man who believed every eye existed to see him. He shook hands, laughed, posed for photos, the perfect image of charm and control. "This is his theater," Ethan murmured under his breath. "He doesn't realize the script's changed." Clara watched from the corner, her pulse sinking with the orchestra's slow overture. The predator was about to meet his prey. The lights dimmed as the presentation began. Mr. Lawson stepped onto the stage with the ease of a man who had never been questioned. His voice carried effortlessly through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Tonight, we unveil the future of predictive analytics." Applause rose like a tide. Ethan's hands tightened behind his back. He knew every word that was supposed to come next, and how false it was. He waited for the perfect moment. Backstage, Clara stood behind the curtains, gripping her flash drive so tightly it left marks on her palm. She could hear his voice echo through the speakers, calm and rehearsed, selling her work as his own. Each sentence was a dagger wrapped in silk. "Our innovation," he said proudly, "is built on discipline, leadership, and vision." The audience nodded. None of them noticed the woman behind the curtain, whose vision had built it all. Her humiliation had been public. So would his. Ethan caught Maya's whisper in his ear. "Greg's moving toward the back hall, probably checking cables." His jaw clenched. "Delay him," he ordered. Lucas replied quickly, "Already done. The server access is locked for 5 minutes." Ethan glanced toward Clara, seeing the faint outline of her silhouette in the shadows. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, but the truth was, neither of them knew how this would end. They only knew it had to happen. Mr. Lawson clicked to the next slide, and the giant screen behind him came alive with data. False, manipulated numbers he'd rehearsed for weeks. "This," he said, gesturing proudly, "is the foundation of our next decade." Ethan's voice was calm, but firm through the comm. "Now." Maya pressed the key. The room blinked once, as if exhaling. Then in the space of a heartbeat, the entire presentation changed. The audience gasped. On the screen appeared a single name, created by Clara Hayes. For a moment, silence swallowed the hall. Mr. Lawson froze, hands suspended mid-air, a polite smile stuck on his face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The slides continued on their own, Clara's original work, restored in flawless order. The real numbers, the real analysis, the real brilliance he had tried to bury. Investors leaned forward, whispering to one another, eyes widening as they saw the difference. "That's not the same model," someone murmured. "It's better." Ethan stepped away from the booth, walking calmly toward the front. His father's gaze met his, cold, questioning, furious. "Ethan," Lawson said through gritted teeth, "turn it off." But Ethan didn't stop. "This," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is the real presentation, the one you switched before the meeting." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara, trembling but steady, emerged from backstage, her face illuminated by the same lights that once humiliated her. Mr. Lawson's mask began to crack. "This is absurd," he said, laughing nervously. "She's confused. We ran tests and—" Ethan cut him off sharply. "No, you ran sabotage." He turned to the audience. "There's footage. The assistant switched her USB minutes before her presentation. My father let it happen." The screen behind them shifted again, and now the video played. The grainy security footage showed Greg replacing the flash drives. The timestamp confirmed everything. The murmurs turned into outrage. Some investors stood, others whispered urgently into phones. Clara watched in disbelief as the truth, her truth, unfolded for all to see. She should have felt vindicated, but what she felt was heavier, relief mixed with sorrow. Ethan turned to her, voice steady. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. But she shook her head. "Yes, I do." Then she faced the audience and spoke. "All I ever wanted was to be heard. Now you've heard me." Mr. Lawson tried to regain control, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle. "You think this little drama changes anything," he said. "Business is about strength, not sympathy." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They were looking at Clara, the woman whose name now glowed in bold letters across the screen. Ethan stood beside her, shoulders squared. For the first time, his father looked small. "Strength without honor," Ethan said quietly, "isn't strength. It's fear." Security entered the room, unsure of whose orders to follow. Greg had disappeared entirely, leaving only chaos behind. The board members whispered among themselves, already calculating their next move. Clara's presentation continued to play, slide by slide, her ideas captivating the room as they were meant to from the beginning. When it ended, the applause was hesitant, not for the company, not for the man at the podium, but for the truth that had finally been seen. Clara stepped away from the spotlight, her chest heaving with emotion. Ethan followed her, the weight of what they'd done still sinking in. "It's over," she whispered. "No," he said softly, looking toward his father, who stood frozen on stage. "This is just the beginning." Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and investors swarmed with questions. The empire had been shaken to its core, and somewhere in the noise, justice exhaled for the first time. Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle and relentless. Clara stood beneath the awning, staring out at the glistening city. She could still hear the echoes of that applause, softer now but real. Ethan joined her, his coat draped over one arm. "You did it," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "We did it." For the first time since it all began, the air between them felt light. The storm had passed, but its wake was only beginning to show. The morning after the gala was eerily calm, as if the city itself hadn't yet processed what had happened. Headlines screamed from every screen in the lobby. Billionaire CEO exposed by his own son. Paparazzi camped outside Lawson Tower, their flashes sparking like lightning every time someone exited. Inside, whispers slithered through corridors. Some employees avoided eye contact. Others looked at Ethan with quiet awe. The empire was trembling, and everyone knew it. Clara arrived early, clutching her bag tightly. The same halls that once felt like a battlefield now felt like unfamiliar ground. Every step echoed with the ghosts of humiliation and triumph. She expected glares or ridicule, but instead people parted as she passed, not out of scorn, but respect. Still, she kept her head low. She wasn't here for validation. She was here to finish what had begun the night before. Justice had been served, but closure was still missing. In his office, Mr. Lawson stared at the morning paper, his face pale against the window light. Integrity unmasked, inside the Lawson scandal. The headline seemed to scream louder than the city below. His phone buzzed endlessly. Reporters, board members, attorneys. But for once he didn't answer. His reflection in the glass looked older, hollowed. The empire he'd built on control was slipping through his fingers. For the first time, silence frightened him. Ethan entered without knocking. His father didn't turn around. "You've made your point," Lawson said coldly. "Now what?" Ethan remained still. "Now the truth stands. That's all I ever wanted." Lawson laughed softly, the sound bitter. "Truth? You think investors care about truth? They care about power, and you just handed them mine." Ethan took a deep breath. Then maybe it was never yours to begin with. The tension between them thickened like fog. Lawson finally turned, eyes bloodshot, but still burning with pride. "Do you know what you've done?" he said quietly. "You've destroyed our name." Ethan's gaze didn't falter. "No, Dad, you did." The words hung between them like smoke. For a brief second, neither spoke. The air was heavy with the weight of everything unspoken, years of fear, pride, and betrayal. Then Ethan turned and walked out without another word. Meanwhile, Clara sat in the quiet of her cubicle, staring at the resignation letter she'd drafted weeks ago. Her fingers hovered above the delete key. Leaving had always been the goal, but something inside her hesitated now. This company didn't deserve her, but maybe the people who'd watched in silence did. She thought of Ethan, how he'd risked everything for a truth that wasn't even his. The least she could do was face this ending with dignity. The door to her office opened softly. Ethan stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said with a tired smile. She accepted it gratefully, the warmth grounding her. "You should be hiding from the press," she said. He laughed quietly. "They'll get bored soon. They always do." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not awkward, but full of things that didn't need to be said. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "Is he going to fight back?" Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "He's already trying. Lawyers, PR statements, damage control. But there's only so much he can spin when the footage is everywhere." She nodded, staring down at the rim of her cup. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted softly. "Then don't decide yet," Ethan said. "Just breathe for a while. You've earned it." In another part of the building, Maya and Lucas were packing their desks. "You sure about leaving?" Maya asked. Lucas shrugged. "You saw his face last night. The board's going to clean house. We'll be next, one way or another. Maya smiled sadly. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you have to burn the bridge so you never go back. They looked at each other, both knowing they'd never forget what they'd done or who they'd done it for. By midday, reporters had forced their way to the front doors. Flashbulbs burst through the glass, voices shouting questions that no one dared answer. Clara watched from a distance, her pulse steady. She had spent so long afraid of being seen, but now being invisible seemed worse. She took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and walked past them. For once, she didn't hide her face. The cameras could take what they wanted. She had nothing left to fear. Ethan followed a few steps behind, shielding her from the worst of the chaos. "They'll calm down soon," he said softly. "Stories fade fast." Clara looked up at him. "Not this one," she said. "Some stories change people." Her voice carried a quiet conviction that made him pause. She wasn't talking about the media. She was talking about him, about both of them. Something between them had shifted, quietly but permanently. Later that afternoon, they met again on the rooftop terrace, the city sprawling beneath them. The wind was cool, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. "It's strange," Clara said, leaning on the railing. "I thought I'd feel happier." Ethan nodded. "Justice doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels heavy." She smiled faintly. "You sound like you've done this before." He chuckled. "No, I'm just guessing as I go." Down below, board members gathered in limousines, the corporate machine grinding to rebuild itself. Inside, Mr. Lawson made one last call before security shut down his access. "You'll regret this," he said into the receiver, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to anymore. Maybe Ethan, maybe himself. The line went dead, and with it a piece of his certainty. For the first time, the great Mr. Lawson was truly alone. As evening fell, Clara looked at Ethan. "What happens now?" she asked. He thought for a moment before replying. "Now we start over. You, me, maybe not together, but forward." The city lights flickered below, like 1,000 small chances waiting to be taken. "You gave me back my voice," she said quietly. "Then use it," he replied. "Don't ever let anyone take it again." And the silence between them felt like understanding. When they left the rooftop, the sky was beginning to clear. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. Somewhere inside Lawson Tower, history was rewriting itself. Painfully, slowly, but permanently. For Ethan and Clara, the worst was over. What came next would be uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty felt like freedom. And sometimes, Ethan thought, the moment feels exactly like this, quiet, fragile and earned. The next evening, the city buzzed with the aftershock of scandal. News anchors dissected every frame of the leaked footage. Analysts debated ethics, and social media had turned Clara Hayes into both a symbol and a storm. Ethan sat alone in his apartment, lights dimmed, television muted. He didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the silence that followed them. The world was loud, but inside him, everything was unnervingly still, the calm before another collision. Across town, Clara sat by her window, watching traffic lights change without meaning. The world had branded her the woman who exposed a billionaire, yet all she wanted was her ordinary life back. She hadn't left her apartment all day, afraid of the flashing cameras outside. Every call from a journalist went unanswered. But despite her exhaustion, she couldn't shake one thought. Ethan had risked everything, and she hadn't even thanked him properly. That guilt pressed heavier than fame. At Lawson Tower, the boardroom was chaos. Executives argued in circles, voices sharp and panicked. "We can't let this destroy the company," one shouted. "We need a statement," another barked. Mr. Lawson sat at the head of the table, perfectly still. His eyes were distant, the fury drained into something colder. Calculation. "We will recover," he said finally, his voice low. "But first, we control the narrative." His calm terrified them more than his anger ever had. Ethan walked into the meeting without invitation. The room fell silent instantly. "You don't control it anymore," he said flatly. His father's expression barely shifted. "You think you've won, son?" Lawson said quietly. "You've humiliated me in public. But you forget one thing. Reputation can be rebuilt. Bloodlines can't." Ethan held his gaze. "Then maybe it's time this one ends." His voice didn't tremble. The man who once feared his father now stood as his equal. After the meeting, the tower felt emptier than ever. Employees packed boxes, the sound of tape and footsteps echoing through the marble halls. Ethan passed familiar faces. Some nodded in respect, others avoided him entirely. He didn't blame them. Taking down the king meant the court had to fall too. Still, a strange sense of peace settled over him. For once, he wasn't pretending. He was exactly who he was meant to be, a man standing on truth no matter the cost. Clara's phone buzzed late that night. It was an unknown number, but the message was unmistakable. "Meet me tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see. E." Her heart quickened. She hesitated, staring at the text, torn between fear and trust. Then, almost instinctively, she typed back, "Where?" His response came quickly. "Lawson Tower, 8 a.m. The irony wasn't lost on her. The building that had destroyed her might also be the place where her story truly ended. The next morning, the sky was bruised with clouds. Clara arrived early, her heels echoing through the marble lobby. Security guards whispered as she passed, uncertain whether to salute or stare. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. When the doors opened, Ethan was already waiting by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the sprawling skyline. He turned when he heard her footsteps, a small, weary smile crossing his face. "You came." "I almost didn't," she admitted softly. "I wasn't sure I could walk into this place again." Ethan nodded, understanding. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. "But there's one last thing we need to do." He gestured toward the boardroom, the same one where her humiliation had begun. The door stood slightly open, the room empty except for the massive screen and a single laptop on the table. "I wanted you to see this before anyone else," he said quietly. Curious but cautious, Clara stepped inside. The smell of coffee and cold ambition still lingered. On the screen, a new presentation waited, titled "The Future of Lawson Enterprises." "This is your work," Ethan explained. "The board voted this morning to relaunch the company's innovation branch, with you listed as the lead developer. They want to rebuild trust, and this time they're doing it the right way." Clara blinked, stunned. "You're serious?" He smiled, completely. Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden. "After everything, they still want me," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "They need you. Not because of pity, because you're the only one who can fix what he broke." Her voice trembled. "I don't know if I can trust them again." Ethan stepped closer. "Then trust yourself. That's all that matters now." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. For the first time since her humiliation, she felt seen, not as a victim, but as the architect of her own redemption. Before she could respond, the door opened behind them. Mr. Lawson stood there, composed but hollow-eyed. The silence stretched. "So," he said finally, "this is how it ends. My son handing my company to a secretary." Clara's spine stiffened, but she didn't back down. "You mean to the person who actually built it?" she said evenly. Ethan didn't move between them this time. He let her speak. Lawson's lips curled, more in pain than anger. "You think truth wins in the end?" he asked. "It already did," Ethan said quietly. His father's eyes flicked toward him, then to Clara. For a long moment, the man who had once ruled everything simply stood there, stripped of power and pride. Then, without another word, he turned and left. The door closed softly behind him, the sound final, like a curtain falling. Clara exhaled, her shoulders trembling. "That felt different," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's what it feels like when fear loses." They spent the next hour finalizing the presentation, the energy between them calm but electric. The company's rebrand would launch the following week. Same structure, new values. Every decision, every slide bore Clara's signature now. "It's strange," she said, scrolling through the slides. "This used to feel like his world. Now it feels like mine." Ethan nodded. "That's because it is." She looked up at him and smiled. "Then let's make it worth it." As they left the boardroom, the skyline burned with morning light. The storm that had followed them for weeks finally seemed to break apart, replaced by something softer. Hope. "Thank you," Clara said, turning to Ethan. "For everything." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. I didn't save you. You saved yourself." She smiled at that, a genuine, quiet smile that said more than gratitude ever could. Together they walked toward the elevators, side by side. But as the doors closed, a faint sound echoed behind them, the ping of an incoming email. Neither noticed it, but on the screen they'd left behind, a new message appeared. "Urgent. Internal audit findings. Confidential." The subject line pulsed like a heartbeat. Whatever peace they had found, it seemed, wasn't ready to last. Because in the world of power and pride, truth was never the end. It was only the beginning of the next test. The following morning dawned brighter than any day in weeks. For the first time, Lawson Tower stood quiet. No reporters, no chaos, just the hum of rebuilding. Clara walked through the lobby with a calm she hadn't felt in months. Every employee she passed looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with something close to admiration. Her name had become a whisper of change. Still, something about the silence unsettled her. Peace never lasted long in places built on pride. Upstairs, Ethan arrived early, coffee in hand, his thoughts already racing. The email from the night before had spread like wildfire among the board. He hadn't opened it yet. He wanted to wait until Clara arrived. The subject line still burned in his mind. Internal audit findings. Confidential. There was a weight to those words, a chill that crawled under his skin. Whatever it contained, he knew it wasn't good. And he had a feeling his father was behind it. Clara entered the office minutes later, her presence soft but grounded. "You got the email too?" she asked. Ethan nodded, handing her a cup. "I didn't open it yet. Thought we should do it together." She smiled faintly. "You're learning to be cautious." "No," he said. "Just realistic." Together, they sat at the conference table where everything had once fallen apart. The screen flickered to life as Ethan clicked open the file. The room seemed to hold its breath. The first lines appeared like cracks spreading through glass. Unauthorized fund allocation. Tampering of financial records. Project Hayes, reclassified as unsanctioned research. Clara's brow furrowed. "What is this?" she whispered. Ethan scrolled further. The report named her directly, suggesting she had bypassed corporate approval to present her innovation. "They're framing you," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "Someone inside the board wants to shift the blame." Clara went pale. "It's starting again." He clenched his jaw, fury simmering beneath his calm. "They can't do this," he muttered. "We exposed the truth." Clara shook her head, eyes wide. You don't understand. Once it's in writing, in an official audit, it doesn't matter what's true. It becomes record. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing near the window. The skyline glowed indifferent beyond the glass. Then we prove it's false, he said. We trace whoever planted this. Clara watched him, torn between fear and faith. Hours later they met with Maya and Lucas, who had agreed to stay off the books to help them. The four crowded around Ethan's laptop, screens full of encrypted data and timestamps. Whoever did this used internal credentials, Lucas said, typing furiously. Someone high level. Maya frowned. This isn't just retaliation, it's cleanup. Someone's trying to rewrite history before the dust settles. Ethan leaned forward. Find the access trail. Follow it until it breaks. As the afternoon wore on, tension filled the air like static. Every clue led to another dead end, until Lucas froze. Wait! Here, he said, pointing to a line of code. This access ID, it's Greg's. Ethan's pulse jumped. He's still in the system? Maya nodded grimly. Barely. Someone reinstated his credentials last night. Clara's voice was quiet but sharp. Who has the authority to do that? The answer landed heavy before anyone said it. Mr. Lawson. By evening, Ethan was standing outside his father's penthouse door. His knuckles hovered over the polished wood before he finally knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing Mr. Lawson in his robe, a glass of whiskey in hand. I wondered how long it would take you, he said calmly. Ethan stepped inside, eyes locked on him. You planted the audit. Lawson's lips curved slightly. No, I just made sure the truth had structure. His tone was smooth, deliberate. You made a mess, Ethan. I'm simply restoring order. Ethan's patience snapped. Order, he said, his voice rising. You're destroying what's left of your name. Again. Lawson's eyes hardened. My name built this world. You think you can replace it with righteousness and guilt? You'll learn soon enough. Idealism doesn't survive boardrooms. Ethan took a step closer, fists clenched. And you'll learn that fear doesn't last forever. For the first time, his father flinched, not visibly but deep in his eyes. The foundation was cracking. Back at the office, Clara reviewed the audit again, her frustration mounting. The evidence was so well crafted, it almost looked genuine. They'll believe it, she whispered. Every piece matches. Maya placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we make them believe something else. The truth. Clara looked up, her expression shifting from defeat to determination. If they want another presentation, she said slowly, we'll give them one. The last one. Maya nodded, understanding instantly. The revelation. Ethan returned just before midnight, eyes shadowed but burning with purpose. He's behind it, he said simply. He wants to rewrite everything, even now. Clara turned her laptop toward him, the title, The Revelation, already displayed on the first slide. Then we rewrite it back, she said firmly. Publicly. Again. He hesitated. You're sure? She met his gaze without blinking. He took my voice once. I won't let him take the truth. For a moment, Ethan saw in her the strength his father never had. The next day, invitations went out for an emergency board meeting, called by Clara herself. The investors were eager to hear how Lawson Enterprises would move forward after the scandal. None of them knew what awaited them. When Ethan entered the building that morning, the tension felt different this time, less like fear, more like fire. Clara was already in the boardroom, rehearsing her words one last time. This time, she told him, I end it my way. When the meeting began, the board members filled the room, whispering among themselves. Mr. Lawson sat near the head of the table, expression cool, eyes sharp. Clara stood at the center, calm, composed, every inch the professional he'd once tried to humiliate. Before we begin, she said, her voice carrying easily, I'd like to share new findings about the company's audit. Ethan watched her, pride swelling quietly in his chest. She wasn't the same woman anymore. She was the storm now. As the lights dimmed, the screen came alive, but not with graphs or projections. Instead, it showed a digital trail of access logs and security timestamps, evidence tracing the false audit back to Greg's account and then to Lawson's authorization code. The room went still. Clara turned to face him. "You taught me data doesn't lie," she said, her tone steady. "So here it is." The billionaire's mask shattered completely. Gasps erupted as board members realized what they were seeing. Lawson rose, furious. "You think this erases what you did?" he shouted. "You're finished in this industry." Clara's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe," she said softly, "but at least I'm not finished as a human being." The words hit harder than any accusation. Ethan stepped beside her, facing the board. "Effective immediately," he said, "the Lawson name will no longer stand for deceit. From now on, it stands for accountability." The room erupted, half outrage, half applause. The reign of power had finally broken. When the chaos subsided, Clara turned off the screen and faced Ethan. "It's over," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "It really is." Outside, the sky broke open in sunlight, flooding the city below. The empire his father built had fallen, but from its ruins, something new was rising. Not of greed, but of truth. And for the first time, Ethan and Clara didn't just feel victorious. They felt free. The next 48 hours tore through the city like wildfire. News outlets replayed clips from the board meeting, freezing on Clara's calm face and Mr. Lawson's rage. Commentators called it the most dramatic corporate reckoning of the decade. Online hashtags exploded, Clara Hayes Truth and Lawson Empire Falls. Stock prices tumbled, reporters camped outside the company gates, and the world that once worshipped the billionaire now dissected his downfall. For the first time, silence didn't protect him. It condemned him. Inside Lawson Tower, chaos reigned. Executives resigned, phones rang non-stop, and legal teams worked through the night to contain the damage. Ethan watched the storm from his office, feeling strangely detached. He'd imagined his father's fall 1,000 times, but reality was quieter, sadder. There was no satisfaction, only exhaustion. Lara entered quietly, holding 2 coffees. "You haven't slept," she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Neither have you." They shared a silence that said everything words couldn't. Across town, Mr. Lawson sat in his penthouse surrounded by half-packed boxes and unanswered calls. The empire that once bowed to him now treated him like a liability. His reflection in the window looked almost unfamiliar, older, smaller. For decades, he'd believed control was the same as love, power the same as respect. Now both had slipped away. His hand trembled as he reached for his glass, realizing too late that pride had been his only true addiction. By morning, the official statement hit every major news outlet. Effective immediately, Jonathan Lawson has resigned as CEO of Lawson Enterprises. The announcement sent another shockwave through the business world. The same. People who once praised his leadership now distanced themselves in carefully worded memos. Clara watched the press conference on a muted screen, her expression unreadable. "He's gone," Ethan said quietly beside her. She nodded, her voice soft. "So why doesn't it feel like victory?" The truth was, victories built on pain rarely felt sweet. Clara stared at the empty hallway outside the conference room, remembering the night she'd fled it in tears. The ghosts of laughter and shame still lingered there, but now they seemed powerless. "You faced him," Ethan said gently. "That's what matters." She met his gaze, her eyes tired but clear. "Maybe, but I keep thinking, how many others did he silence before me?" Ethan hesitated. Then maybe it's our job to make sure you're the last. Later that afternoon, the board gathered once more, not to celebrate, but to stabilize. They voted unanimously to keep Clara as lead strategist in the restructuring. Her title wasn't just symbolic, it was earned. The new vision of Lawson Enterprises would focus on ethical transparency and social innovation, ideas once dismissed as weakness. Irony suits you, Maya teased as she handed Clara the official contract. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe redemption does too. Ethan spent the rest of the day handling media questions and calming investors. Every interview felt like walking a tightrope, balancing truth with tact, vulnerability with leadership. He was careful not to vilify his father, but refused to excuse him either. "My father built something remarkable," he said during one interview. "But even the strongest structures collapse when their foundation is pride." The reporter nodded solemnly. His words went viral within hours. By evening, the tower felt different, lighter somehow. Employees smiled again, voices no longer hushed by fear. In the cafeteria, laughter replaced whispers. Clara walked through the halls, watching as the company slowly began to heal. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it. She paused at the elevator and looked at her reflection in the polished steel. For the first time she saw not the secretary who'd been humiliated, but the woman who'd rewritten her story. Meanwhile, Mr. Lawson's name vanished from the building overnight. Workers removed his portrait from the lobby, leaving behind a blank white wall. It was oddly poetic, a clean slate where arrogance had once hung. He watched the coverage from his living room, face expressionless. "It was supposed to last forever," he murmured. "But empires, like men, rot from the inside long before they fall." And his had been crumbling for years. The world was merely catching up. That night, Ethan drove to his father's penthouse, unsure why. The door was already open when he arrived. Lawson sat by the window, no drink, no pretense, just silence. "You got what you wanted," he said without turning around. Ethan shook his head. "No, I got what was necessary." Lawson's voice cracked. "Do you hate me?" Ethan's answer was quiet. "No, but I can't admire you anymore." The words hurt them both, but they were honest. As Ethan left, he felt an unexpected weight lift from his chest. The war between loyalty and morality had finally ended. He didn't need his father's approval anymore. Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle, cleansing. Clara called as he stepped into the street. "Are you okay?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Better than I've been in years." She paused, then said softly, "Then maybe this really is the beginning." He believed her. The next morning, news broke that Clara Hayes had been nominated for an Industry Innovation Award, the same recognition her project would have earned months earlier had it not been stolen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She accepted, quietly, refusing interviews, focusing instead on rebuilding her team. Ethan sent her flowers with a note that read, "For the real presentation." When she read it, she laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes from surviving the impossible. Maya and Lucas stopped by her office that afternoon, carrying coffee and smiles. "So what now?" Maya asked. Clara looked around the room, her room now, and exhaled. "Now," she said, "we build something worth believing in." Lucas grinned. "And if he tries to take it again?" Clara smirked. "Then we remind him what truth looks like." They laughed softly, but beneath it lay an unspoken promise. Never again. At sunset, Ethan and Clara met one last time at the rooftop terrace. The city below shimmered in gold and rose, the chaos finally quiet. "It's strange," Ethan said. "We started this in a boardroom full of lies and ended up here, with peace." Clara smiled. Peace built on truth. They stood side by side, watching the lights flicker on one by one. "Do you ever think it was fate?" he asked. She shook her head gently. "No, just choice and courage." Below them, a new sign was being installed at the building's entrance. Hayes and Lawson Innovations, not one above the other, but side by side. The crowd that gathered applauded quietly as the final letter lit up. Ethan looked at Clara, his expression soft. "Equal partners," he said. "Finally." She smiled, eyes bright with pride. "Finally," she echoed. The past no longer chained them. It had shaped them. And together, they'd turned its ashes into something new. Weeks passed, and the storm that had once consumed their lives slowly began to settle. The headlines faded, the cameras disappeared, and the world moved on. But inside Lawson Tower, something entirely new was taking shape. The air no longer smelled of fear, but of ambition reborn. Clara walked through the open plan office, smiling faintly as she passed her new team. Every conversation, every idea was alive with purpose. For the first time, the company felt human again. Ethan watched from his glass office, the same space that had once belonged to his father. He'd refused the title of CEO, instead naming Clara as co-director. "It's your vision that saved us," he'd said simply, and he meant it. She had protested at first, but he insisted. The world doesn't need another Lawson in charge. It needs someone who remembers why truth matters. Now, seeing her lead meetings and inspire confidence, he knew he'd been right. Their relationship had become a quiet partnership, built on mutual respect rather than the chaos that had first bound them. They didn't need to speak much to understand each other anymore. When one faltered, the other steadied. When one doubted, the other believed. They were no longer two people surviving the same storm. They were architects rebuilding something greater from its ruins, proof that justice could create, not just destroy. One afternoon, Clara visited the old conference room, the same one where she'd once been humiliated. The projector still hung from the ceiling, but everything else had changed. New paint, new furniture, new light. She stood there for a long moment, remembering the trembling of her hands, the laughter of strangers, the quiet smirk on Mr. Lawson's face. The memory no longer broke her, it strengthened her. "You don't own this room anymore," she whispered. "I do." That night, Ethan found her there, lost in thought. "You always end up in this room," he said gently. She smiled without turning. "Maybe I'm taking it back, 1 minute at a time." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Looks like you already have." Their eyes met, the air between them soft but charged. "You know," he said, quietly, "if courage had a face, it would probably look like yours." Clara laughed softly. "Then yours must look like guilt trying to do better." The following week, they held their first public event under the new banner, Hayes and Lawson Innovations. The audience wasn't full of investors this time, but young engineers, interns and students. Clara stood on stage and spoke, her voice steady, her message simple. Success means nothing if it costs your soul. Integrity isn't weakness. It's the foundation of everything worth building. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was sincere. And for her, that was enough. In the back of the auditorium, Ethan watched her with quiet pride. She had become what he'd always hoped the company could be, fearless, compassionate and real. He thought of his father and wondered if the man had ever wanted that too, once upon a time. Maybe corruption hadn't started with greed, but with fear. Fear of being forgotten. Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing he no longer carried that fear himself. He didn't need to outshine anyone anymore. That evening, Clara returned to her apartment for the first time in weeks. It felt smaller now, Not because it had changed, but because she had. The walls that once held her tears now felt like a museum of a life she'd outgrown. She poured a cup of tea, opened her laptop, and began writing a proposal for a mentorship program, one that would protect young employees from the kind of injustice she had faced. Redemption, she realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about building a bridge where there once was fire. Meanwhile, Ethan visited his father for the first time since the fall. The penthouse was half empty, stripped of trophies and awards. Mr. Lawson sat in silence by the window, staring at the skyline that no longer belonged to him. "You look well," Ethan said, trying to bridge the gap. His father didn't turn. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he murmured. "Your company's in the papers again." Ethan smiled faintly. This time for the right reasons. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Mr. Lawson asked, almost in a whisper, "Was it worth it?" Ethan looked at him carefully. "Telling the truth always is," he said. His father finally turned, and for the first time, Ethan didn't see anger, just regret. "I wanted to protect what I built, but I forgot," said quietly, "that what I built was people." Ethan nodded. "Then maybe it's not too late to remember." They shook hands, not as rivals, but as two flawed men learning to begin again. Back at the office, Clara received an invitation to speak at an international ethics conference. It was an honor she never could have imagined a year ago. When she told Ethan, he grinned. "You realize this means you're officially the face of integrity, right?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't remind me." But secretly she felt proud, not of the fame, but of the message, that one act of courage could ripple far beyond the walls where it began. On the day of her speech, Ethan surprised her at the airport. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" he said with a grin. She shook her head, touched. "You hate flying." "For this," he said, "I'll survive." On the plane, as the city disappeared beneath them, Clara looked out the window and realized something profound. The story that had nearly destroyed her had also set her free. Pain had turned to purpose. Fear had turned to fire. Her talk at the conference was simple and powerful. "The worst moments in your life," she told the audience, "can become the foundation for your best ones, if you let them." When she finished, the applause rose slowly, then grew until it filled the hall. She didn't smile for the cameras or bask in the attention. Instead, she found Ethan in the crowd and met his gaze. That was enough. Redemption didn't need an audience. It just needed to be lived. When they returned home, the company was thriving again. New projects, new hires, new hope. But for Clara and Ethan, success no longer meant numbers or headlines. It meant quiet mornings, honest conversations, and a shared belief that decency could change the world. One night, as they stood on the same rooftop where everything had begun, Clara turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd walked away?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "No, because we didn't." Below them, the city pulsed with light, alive, imperfect, and real. The skyline wasn't a symbol of dominance anymore, but of possibility. "You know," Clara said softly, "I used to think courage was about speaking up, but maybe it's about what you do afterward, how you live with the truth." Ethan nodded. "Then we're both still learning." She smiled. "Good. I never want to stop." And as the night wind carried their laughter through the city, redemption no longer felt like a dream. It felt like home. Autumn crept quietly into the city, brushing the skyline with shades of rust and gold. Weeks had passed since the conference, and life had finally found a rhythm again. The chaos had softened into memory, the noise of scandal replaced by the hum of rebuilding. But not everyone moved on as easily. In a quiet apartment overlooking the river, Jonathan Lawson sat alone, surrounded by fragments of his past and awards, photographs, and the faint echo of applause that no longer belonged to him. He hadn't left the apartment in days. The world that once revolved around him had turned without pause, leaving him behind like a forgotten statue. The company's new name, Hayes and Lawson Innovations, appeared on every magazine cover. Ironically, it was the only reminder of his legacy still standing. Every time he saw it, a strange mix of pride and pain welled inside him. So, this is what survival looks like, he muttered to the empty room, without me. One morning, he received a letter. It wasn't formal or typed, just a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside an envelope. The handwriting was familiar. "We're hosting an anniversary dinner for the new company," it read. "You're invited. No cameras, just family." It was signed by Ethan. Lawson stared at it for a long time, uncertain whether to laugh or tear it apart. Family. The word felt foreign now. Yet, beneath the bitterness, a flicker of longing stirred. That evening, he found himself standing outside the new headquarters, staring up at the logo glowing softly against the dark sky. His name was still there, but smaller, equal beside hers. He hesitated before stepping inside. The lobby looked different, warmer, alive. Employees greeted him politely, not with fear, but with courtesy. For the first time, he wasn't Sir. He was just a man walking through the remnants of his empire toward the only thing he hadn't completely lost, his son. Ethan met him in the private dining room, a space lined with photographs of new beginnings. Clara was there too, standing beside a display of the company's projects. When she saw Lawson, she paused but didn't retreat. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her tone calm but measured. "Thank you for coming." He inclined his head stiffly. "It seems I owe you congratulations." She smiled faintly. "You owe yourself forgiveness more than that." The words landed softly, but they struck deep. Dinner began awkwardly. The clinking of cutlery filled the silence where conversation should have been. Ethan tried to bridge the gap. "We didn't invite you to talk about the past," he said gently. "We wanted you to see what came from it." Lawson looked around the room, young engineers laughing, prototypes gleaming under the lights, Clara at ease among her peers. He'd built an empire of fear. They'd built one of integrity. "It's impressive," he admitted quietly. "Different. Better." After dinner, Ethan led his father to the rooftop terrace, the same place where he and Clara had once stood after the scandal. The night was crisp, the city glowing below them. "You know," Lawson said, his voice low, "I used to come up here to remind myself of what I'd conquered. Now it feels like I'm looking at what I lost." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't lose, Dad. You just stopped listening." Lawson's eyes softened. "And she made you start again." For the first time, there was no argument between them, no power struggle, just quiet understanding. Lawson's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "You were right," he said finally. "I built everything to be admired, not to be good. I wanted control because I was afraid of irrelevance." Ethan studied him carefully. "And now?" Lawson smiled faintly. "Now I'm irrelevant anyway, but maybe not useless." There was humility in his tone, a language he was still learning. Clara joined them a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Lawson. "I wasn't sure how you take it," she said. He chuckled softly. "Bitter, like I used to be." They stood together in silence, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. "You know," Lawson said, "I've been angry at you for months, for humiliating me, for exposing me. But the truth is, you freed me from myself." Clara smiled gently. Then maybe it was worth it. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Lawson wandered through the lobby one last time. He stopped at a framed photograph near the entrance, an image of Clara and Ethan on stage, unveiling the company's new logo. Beneath it was a quote she had chosen: "Integrity is the only legacy that lasts." He read it twice, the words sinking in. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel defensive. He just felt quiet, tired, but at peace. Ethan found him there. "You thinking about stealing the frame?" he teased softly. Lawson smiled, a real weary smile. "No, just admiring it." They stood side by side, neither speaking for a while. Then Lawson said, "You know, when I was your age, I thought power was proof of worth. But you've shown me something else, that worth comes from what you build in people, not what you build for them." Ethan's voice softened. "Then maybe you've finally built something real." Before leaving, Lawson turned to Clara. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I hope I've earned understanding." She nodded. "You have," she replied. "Forgiveness takes time, but understanding starts now." It was the kindest truth she could give him. He accepted it with a nod. For a man who once demanded admiration, humility now felt like freedom. As he stepped into the elevator, his reflection in the glass no longer looked like a fallen king, just a man trying again. That night, Ethan and Clara stood on the terrace long after everyone else had gone. "He's changing," she said softly. "Maybe not fast, but it's something." Ethan nodded. "He's learning the hardest lesson, that redemption doesn't erase the past. It teaches you to live with it." Clara smiled faintly. "Kind of like us." He looked at her, the wind tugging at her hair. "Exactly like us." The past had left scars, but those scars had turned into maps, reminders of where not to go again. When Lawson returned home, the city was asleep. He poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the moon ripple across the river. For the first time in years, the silence didn't suffocate him. It soothed him. He thought about Clara's words, about Ethan's defiance, about the company still carrying his name, but now for better reasons. He smiled faintly, whispering to the night, "Maybe this is what legacy really is. Not what you keep, but what you leave behind." And somewhere across the city, as the lights of Hayes and Lawson Innovations glowed steady against the skyline, 3 lives, once torn apart by pride, finally aligned under something stronger: understanding. The billionaire had fallen, but the man within him was still standing, and though redemption had come late, it had come all the same. Months later, the city woke to banners stretched across glass towers: Hayes and Lawson Innovations, Global Summit. The company that had once been a battlefield was now a beacon of second chances. Inside the auditorium, technicians hurried, cameras gleamed, and journalists whispered about the miracle of its rebirth. For Clara, the stage no longer symbolized humiliation. It was her redemption ground. The place where truth had once been stolen would now be where it was celebrated. Ethan stood backstage, reviewing notes he didn't need. He wasn't nervous for himself. He was nervous for her. The world had seen Clara as a victim, a whistleblower, a heroine. But today they would see her as what she truly was, a leader. He peeked through the curtain and watched the crowd filling the seats. Familiar faces, investors, students, even a few critics, all drawn by the same thing: the promise of integrity reborn. The weight of the moment was immense, but beautiful. When Clara walked on stage, the lights followed her like recognition long overdue. The applause began slow, then swelled until it filled the entire hall. She smiled, not the fragile smile of survival, but the confident one of ownership. "Good morning," she began, her voice strong and sure. "A year ago, this company stood for ambition without empathy. Today it stands for truth, and truth, as we've learned, is not the opposite of power. It is the foundation of it. Behind her, the screen illuminated with the words, "The Real Presentation." The title drew murmurs and soft laughter from the audience, a knowing nod to the story that had started it all. Clara continued, her tone warm. This isn't just about data or innovation. It's about rebuilding trust with our employees, our clients, and with ourselves. Because no matter how advanced technology becomes, it will always fail without integrity to guide it. Her words resonated deeper than any metric. Ethan watched her speak, pride swelling in his chest. This was her moment, their moment, but he knew she didn't need him beside her anymore. That thought didn't sadden him. It filled him with peace. He remembered the terrified woman clutching her USB drive, the tears in her eyes as the crowd mocked her. Now, that woman was commanding the very same kind of crowd with grace and conviction. It was as if the universe itself had waited for this full circle moment. In the front row, Mr. Lawson sat quietly, a guest instead of a ruler. He'd declined media requests and chosen to attend in silence, watching from the shadows of the audience. As Clara spoke, his expression shifted from pride to humility. Every word she said felt like a mirror, reflecting both his past mistakes and the world his son had fought to create. When the applause rose again, he joined in, not as an owner, but as a witness to what redemption could look like. Clara unveiled the new project, a global initiative for transparent data ethics and corporate mentorship. Our goal, she said, isn't just progress, it's protection. For the dreamers, the innovators, the quiet workers who make the impossible happen. On the screen, the faces of young engineers appeared, diverse, determined, hopeful. She looked out at them, her eyes bright. If you've ever been underestimated, let this be your proof that your voice matters. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the hall, genuine and endless. Clara blinked back tears, but didn't hide them. "Thank you," she said softly. This is the real presentation." The words lingered in the air, carried by emotion rather than echo. Ethan stepped onto the stage, not to share her spotlight, but to stand beside her in quiet solidarity. For once, no one was above anyone. They were equals. In truth, in courage, in legacy. Afterward, the three of them, Clara, Ethan, and Lawson, stood together near the stage. The press captured the image, the fallen titan, the woman who rose, and the son who bridged them. "You did well," Lawson said quietly to Clara. She smiled. "No, we did well, all of us." He looked at her, then at Ethan, and nodded. "You've built something better than I ever did." His voice was unsteady, but sincere, and maybe that's how it should be. Later that evening, the gala wound down, leaving only soft jazz and city lights. Clara slipped onto the balcony to breathe in the cool night air. Ethan joined her, hands in his pockets. "You know," he said with a grin, "you made half that audience cry." She laughed softly. "Including you, especially me." The easy warmth between them no longer felt fragile, and it felt earned. "You changed everything," he said. "No," she replied, "we changed it together." Below, the city shimmered like a sea of second chances. Lawson stepped outside moments later, leaning on the railing beside them. "You two remind me of what I used to dream about," he said quietly. "Building something that mattered." Ethan glanced at him, then dream again, just differently this time. Lawson chuckled, the sound light and unguarded. "Maybe I will." For the first time in his life, he didn't sound like a man defending his legacy. He sounded free. Clara looked out at the skyline, the memory of her first presentation flashing through her mind, the humiliation, the betrayal, the despair. But now, standing, they're surrounded by those who had faced their own darkness and chosen light. It all made sense. "Funny," she said softly. "I used to wish I could erase that day. Now I'm grateful for it." Ethan smiled. "That's what courage does. It turns scars into stories worth telling." They stayed on the balcony long after the last guest left, watching the lights ripple across the river. "Do you think it'll ever be over?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "Truth doesn't end. It just keeps finding new people to fight for it." She nodded, her gaze distant but peaceful. "Then I hope it never stops." The city below seemed to agree, its lights flickering like applause one last time for the story that had begun in shame and ended in grace. When they finally turned to leave, Lawson paused at the doorway and looked back at the hall, the place that had seen his downfall and his son's redemption. "Good night," he said softly, almost to himself. It wasn't farewell. Acceptance. The chapter of arrogance had closed, but the story of legacy continued. Clara and Ethan followed him inside, their footsteps echoing softly. 3 lives forever tied not by blood or power, but by truth. Outside, the night deepened, stars glinting above the city like quiet witnesses. On the tallest tower, the new sign glowed proudly: Hayes and Lawson Innovations. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a promise become with failure pride could yield to integrity, and even broken people could build something whole again. And as the lights dimmed and the city slept, one truth lingered. The real presentation had never been the slides at all. It had been them. Sometimes the most powerful presentations aren't made in boardrooms. They happen in silence, in the moments when we choose honesty over comfort, courage over fear, and compassion over pride. Clara's story began with humiliation, but it didn't end there. It ended with truth, because truth, when spoken with courage, has a way of turning shame into strength. Ethan learned that legacy isn't about what you leave behind in buildings or money, but what you build inside people, their faith, their confidence, their belief that good can still win. And Mr. Lawson, he learned the hardest lesson of all, that redemption doesn't erase your past. It teaches you to live with it, to grow from it, to begin again. Maybe that's what the real presentation really was all along. Not slides or numbers or applause, but people. People brave enough to face themselves and still choose to do what's right. People like Clara, people like Ethan, and maybe people like you. Because at the end of every story, one truth remains. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers. Try again. If this story moved you, take a moment, like this video, to help it reach more hearts. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated and proved them wrong? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that no fall is final, not if you stand up again with truth on your side.